Welcome to the Hollywood in Toto podcast, the right take on entertainment. The HiT cast offers a weekly look at Hollywood from a conservative point of view. Sick of media bias infecting Hollywood headlines? Tired of stars insulting your views? HiT has your back. Now, here's your host, Christian Toto.
Welcome to episode 114 of the Hollywood in Toto podcast, the right take on entertainment. This week we're speaking with Marshall Lewy. He's a respected filmmaker who now works as Wondery's chief content officer. That means he's behind some of the biggest podcasts in the world. He'll tell us more about the business of podcasting and what it makes to make a killer show in 2019, a little bit later. I recently signed up for a free 7-day HBO trial for one reason only. Not Game of Thrones, Leaving Neverland. I confess I've heard so much about this particular documentary, which chronicles two men who claim to have been molested by Michael Jackson over a long period of time, and I just needed to see it myself. I knew it wasn't going to be enjoyable. I actually watched it on a Friday night of all times, which I think would be the kind of time where you want to relax and get some escapism under your belt. No, I just had to see it. I had to process what was out there and even just be part of the cultural conversation and say, I've seen it, and this is my take on the material. Now, I knew some of the interviews would be really difficult to watch. The details I had read about online were just brutal and gruesome and horrifying. So I knew that was coming. It still rocked me. I have to say, I have never been so upset watching anything, whether it's a horror movie, a documentary, than watching this particular film. But was it all true? Was some of it true? Maybe even less than that. Already there have been some discrepancies about the facts shared by the two men in this particular documentary. One of them involves a train station where they said that some of the molestation took place, and it looks pretty conclusively that the train station in question wasn't even built yet. Is that a mistake? A trick of the memory? Or is it revealing something more insidious about the people who are giving all this sordid, horrible information on camera? And of course, Michael Jackson is no longer here to defend himself. He did so on trial and was acquitted. Some of those cases were solved with a little bit of cash pushed one way, not the other. Of course, that looks pretty gross in and of itself. You think a man with all the money at his disposal would want to settle things once and for all, but that is the past, and now we're still trying to figure out whether he was a pedophile, and if so, just how many crimes he committed along the way. Now, I just, even after seeing the movie and hearing about the discrepancies in the story, I'm really not sure what to believe. You hear tales about the different alarms and sensors that were going from the main house to Michael Jackson's bedroom. What could that possibly mean? Is that an intensely private soul, or is it something more sinister? Gosh, we just don't know. And I feel like in today's age, the lines between what we know as fact and what is just conjecture are just so blurry and getting blurrier. I don't know if we're ever going to really know the truth. One of the things that really kind of shook me about the film is the way Michael Jackson allegedly groomed his potential victims. It does match up with how pedophiles act, but certainly you could say that the people in question studied that profile and acted accordingly. And also, there's been talk about, well, maybe the film's director didn't do all his homework. Did he hold himself to a high enough standard? What's the real story about his cooperation here? And did he put things off camera that should have been on camera? And of course, when the movie hit, first in select theaters and then on HBO, the media was all ready to kind of pounce on the story. It was part of the post-Me Too world, and it was about time that Michael Jackson got his comeuppance even after he had passed away. Are we culpable in this as well? We watched Michael Jackson for years and years. His love for children, his affection for them, that was not exactly a secret. We all knew about it, and it all often seemed creepy. Why in the world was he hanging out with these kids so much? Could it really be explained away by someone who just didn't have a childhood and was trying to relive that part of his life? It seems a little bit too neat, too cutesy. I don't know. One thing is clear. The media outlets which sang the film's praises right away when it came out without any cynicism, I'm not sure they did their homework. Here's the HiT tweet of the week. Sarah Silverman is so woke, she's ready, willing, and able to support an anti-Semitic in Congress like Representative Ilhan Omar. But this Silverman tweet isn't about her. It's about you-know-who getting more of that signature Silverman wit. This morning, Trump sat on the toilet, and when he got up 10 minutes later, there was a huge smelly bleep in it. Clearly the work of the violent alt-left. Man, I really miss comedy.
You're listening to the Hollywood in Toto podcast, the right take on entertainment.
My hit tip of the week is Chuck. It's only fitting that a movie about a forgotten boxing figure got completely ignored in theaters 2 years ago. Chuck follows Chuck Wepner, played brilliantly here by Liev Schreiber. He's a mediocre fighter at best with the proverbial lion's heart, and he's got a shot at the big time, a fight with Muhammad Ali. Well, if you're any kind of sports fan, you probably know what happened next, and it wasn't exactly a heroic turn for Chuck Wepner. Spoiler alert, but you'd think a movie about his life and about that particular moment would be all about that fight. It'd be leading up to that extreme moment in his life and what happened afterwards, perhaps, maybe an anecdote or two. No, this part of his career is just a footnote. This is a character study about a fighter who nearly had it all, didn't quite get there, and what did he do next? How did he kind of change his life or maybe even succumb to the demons? What do you do when fame and youth are fleeting and you're so desperate for one, you squander the other? Well, when they call you the Bayonne Bleeder, I think that's partly a clue that things aren't going to always go your way. Now, like I said, Chuck got the cold shoulder in theaters. The awards season that time around didn't exactly rush to give him any nominations. It got pretty much ignored. But Chuck is streaming right now on Netflix. I highly recommend it.
You're listening to my daddy's podcast. He still sleeps with the nightlight on.
Now let's get to this week's HitCast interview. Of course, we all know podcasting is all the rage, and thank goodness for that. A new study shows that 90 million people will listen to a podcast at least once a month this year. Look out, radio. So I thought it was a great time to interview Marshall Lewy. Now, you may not know the name, but he's a filmmaker behind movies like Blue State, but he's also an audio pioneer. He's part of the Wondery podcasting network. That's the giant company that gave us Dirty John, Dr. Death, and so much more. 2 more shows you shouldn't miss from the Wondery library: Imagine Life and 1+1. The former follows a famous person's life told in the second person, so we don't really know who they're describing. We get clue after clue, hint after hint, and then eventually we have to see if we can guess who it is before he or she is finally revealed. Pretty cool, right? Now, 1+1 is something different. It takes a look at some really creative pairings from across the cultural landscape. Could be basketball, could be different sports, could be entertainment, music, you name it. 2 people who came together to make something even more extraordinary. Now, Lewy shares more on these shows and also why his crystal ball is a bit fuzzier than you'd think, given his pretty important position at Wondery. Here's my chat with Marshall Lewy. Well, Marshall, you're the chief content officer for Wondery, and of course that gig didn't exist 10 years ago. The company didn't exist 10 years ago. And you're a filmmaker as well. You're a storyteller. Just real briefly, maybe kind of share how you ascended to Wondery, because it's such a unique gig and it's such a fascinating new landscape, and it seemed like you were perfectly situated for it. But maybe just in your own words, tell me about that evolution.
Sure. So I started as a writer-director. I went to film school, worked at a couple of film production companies, and worked as a production assistant on film. And then I went to Columbia Film School, made a couple of films, one called Blue State with Anna Paquin and one called California Solo with Robert Carlyle that was at Sundance. And about a year after that came out, I started working at a company called Adaptive Studios that was focused on multi-platform storytelling. So we were creating, in addition to regular film and TV, books and graphic novels and digital short form. So kind of any medium that you could tell a story where you didn't need somebody to give you millions of dollars to tell that story, mm-hmm. and to bring it to life as a way to get it back to film and TV. And so through that, I learned how to tell stories across lots of different media and found that I really liked it as well. That exploring the differences in what is a podcast versus what's a novel versus what's a digital short form. How is that different than a traditional linear TV show? Like a lot of, and like a lot of other people were getting, sorry, let me take that part back.
Yeah, go ahead.
And me, like a lot of other people, were becoming obsessed with podcasts. Just it was something that I was listening to on my long commute when I was running, all kinds of stuff. And, found myself being someone who was like recommending, you got to listen to this podcast, more than I was saying, you got to listen to, go see this movie. Podcast didn't even exist, to your point, when I went to film school. So I couldn't have known that I wanted to be making them when I was at film school. So that's what kind of led me here. It just seemed like the thing that I was most passionate about, honestly, and started looking into it more and more as a place where I might be able to actually make stuff. And the opportunity to come to Wondery came up about a year and a half ago or so. And that's when I joined, and it's a really interesting place to be because it is in Los Angeles, and we're kind of focused on making podcasts that do sound a little more cinematic, that are more immersive. And that is, I love, I listen and have listened to all kinds of podcasts from public radio and other places, but it's nice to be at a place that's trying to take the best of what they do and also do something different and expand the form of the medium as well.
And you're a perfect person to be there now just because of your background, and a lot of the podcasting, either the topics or the shows are kind of making the jump to either small or big screens. Talk about that pipeline. It seems like it's moving quickly, but I think there's such a hunger for unique content, and I think podcasting in our realm of reboots and remakes and sequels is sort of a kind of a fresh terrain for really good original content.
Yeah, I do think that people want something that kind of proves an idea, or is a way to see whether an idea has either a built-in audience or has legs before they're willing to commit to it for TV or film. So it's definitely a moment where people are looking to podcasts between the success of Dirty John, the success of Homecoming on Amazon, which Julia Roberts was in and came from Gimlet. People are looking, and you do have a lot of film and television executives who are in their cars in Los Angeles or on the subway in New York who are listening to these stories. And so it's really cool that they have this personal connection as fans, right? It's not just that they're looking for what could be the next TV series. They would be listening to Dr. Death anyway. And that's fun as well.
Yeah. Is there a podcast on Wondery that you thought, I like it, I believe in it, but I just don't know if it's going to kind of click, and then it did? I'm kind of curious because it's often hard to tell what's going to be a hit, a film, a TV show, a book. But from your perspective, were there any shows that you kind of were rooting for them to succeed, didn't know if they would, but then they just exploded all the same?
I think the best example of that is Dr. Death, because it was the first big one that I did when I was here, and from the time I'd first been here. So I hoped for the best. I knew that the story was great, but I remember that first morning when it came out, and through marketing efforts, it got a lot of attention. And then I remember waiting until the afternoon to see when the first reviews on Apple Podcasts would come up and be like, well, that's really the mark, is let's see if people like it. I'm glad it got out there. Now let's see if people like it. And the response was just so strong. And then it was so sustained. And then, in a week or two later, when, I was online at the gas station and hear people talking about Dr. Death, who I have no idea who they are, that was the first time in my life that I'd had that experience where I had worked on something that had such deep penetration and like so much, kind of became a thing that it felt like people were talking about. That was really exciting.
It's almost like the opening day grosses on a film where you're kind of looking for that headline, that update, and now it's like looking at the iTunes reviews and seeing what the sort of the pulse of the audience thinks. I want to talk switch gears a little bit to the show that it just sounds so great on the surface, but I imagine it's really tough to produce. Imagine Life, the mystery show that kind of slowly reveals a personality. Talk about, was that a tough one to kind of crack, or did it kind of come organically? Because it seems like that's great on paper, but really hard to pull off behind the scenes.
Yeah, so the idea came from Hernan Lopez, our CEO, and I think the idea came very quickly of this idea of the fact that we use these second person scenes in some of our other shows like American History Tellers, which uses 3 or 4 of these imagined scenes throughout each episode to kind of put you in the shoes of someone who is living through a different period, whether it's the Depression or Prohibition. The idea of doing an entire series where the entire episode is in the second person. Mm-hmm. You are personally experiencing in the shoes of somebody else. And then, we sort of evolved to the idea that it could be somebody famous. So at the end, you're sort of getting clues along the way. And at the end, you find out that the you've been hearing about is Elon Musk or J.K. Rowling or Yoko Ono or whoever it might be. And that part will happen fairly quickly. And then translating that into exactly what it is was a harder proposition. We talked a lot about how you tell the story of somebody who everybody knows so well while playing the simultaneous challenge of investing people in it emotionally while also creating sort of a guessing game. Like, can you have both sides of your brain working, the side that's getting emotionally invested in the journey that you're going on and the side that's trying to figure out who you are. And it's a credit to Stephanie Jens, who's the executive producer on it, who works here, and Jeff Schmidt, who sound designs it, to just have really put that into practice in a way that it works for listeners, and you can have both. That was the biggest question I had going into is, can you have both? Can you play a guessing game and immerse the listener in an emotional experience and a journey?
That sounds like a brutal show to produce. I don't mean it in a bad way, but just how challenging it is. One of the things I was thinking about the types of shows that you create, I feel like there's so much information we have right now. We can just ask Alexa for this or that, a fact, a figure. Is it hard for the storytellers that you work with to get so much detail, so much richness behind the scenes where the listener says, oh, I know this figure, and even I didn't know that. Is that is that bar even higher now, just based on our digital age?
That's a good question. I think they do a ton of research and then trying to synthesize that research into what the core journey of whoever the person is. Mm-hmm. And that applies not just to Imagine Life, but to all our shows.
Yeah.
Business Wars or 1+1, these where you're telling a story. We spend a lot of time really zeroing in on what is this story really about? A lot of business stories, for example, are David and Goliath stories, or what is that need that's driving the person in Imagine Life? So it doesn't just become a laundry list of facts.
Yeah. Yep.
Because that's not interesting to say. And then he did this, and then she did that. It has to sort of be in service of whatever the driving force behind their success or their struggles are.
Mm-hmm. One of the shows you just mentioned is 1+1, about, I guess you could say, dynamic duos, 2 creative people coming together. Is there a particular episode of this series that you've enjoyed the most or thought that was the most either innovative or interesting, or just as a listener, just liked it?
I'm really excited. We have, Shaq versus Kobe. So 1+1 is about creative pairs and genius pairs that come together and are more than the sum of their parts, essentially, across all different areas of disciplines. We're doing a lot of musicians, we're doing athletes, we're doing artists, we're doing thinkers. The first series was about Shaq and Kobe, who drove the Lakers to multiple championships, but kind of had a real love-hate relationship, to say the least. And the next one we're doing to show the range is Frida Kahlo and Diego Rivera. So I'm really excited about that one. I really like the first episode of that and kind of learning about how they met. and how their lives influenced each other. And I think Frida's story kind of in 2019 is a really interesting one. Much younger woman, much older man who was much more revered in his time, and whether their relationship, the nature of their relationship was like hurtful or helpful to Frida's art is a really interesting story.
Yeah. I'll put mine into the suggestion box. Elvis Costello and Paul McCartney. I think it was about 25 or 30 years ago, but I was just intrigued by that pairing. I want to talk a little bit about podcasting in general, because I think when you look at the culture we live in, we've got smartphones, we scan for headlines. I see my son playing a video game and watching a show on his little tablet. I feel like it's sensory overload. Everything is really quick. It's fast cuts. It's, compare Dumbo to like a Pixar film. They're just different. And then there's podcasting, where it's a long-form conversation or a long story, and we're hooked, and we can't get enough of it. And I always mention Joe Rogan, which is like 3 bloody hours long or so, and we're sitting there listening to it. Do you think that our hunger for podcasting is sort of a direct kind of a contrast between how fast we are as a society? What's sort of the secret sauce here? Because it doesn't make sense on paper.
I think in some ways it's the best of what we have in digital culture right now. So if you think about the ways that people feel so connected to people on social media, on Instagrammers, YouTubers, people who they follow on Twitter, but and it's free, it's easily available on everybody's smartphone. So it has all those advantages, but to your point, it's long form storytelling, and you get to really spend time with the story that you're listening to or the person. Before all these interview podcasts, for example, you might watch Charlie Rose or Inside the Actor Studio to really hear a long interview with somebody. And of course, there was fresh air on the radio. But now, you can hear hour, 2 hour, 3 hour long interviews with people that you admire all the time. And people really, I think in this fast paced culture, people like being able to settle in and really go deeper on things. And that's why people get obsessed with these serialized podcasts as well. They can just like sink into a story that goes for a while, that they can do while they're doing something else, that they don't have to like look at a screen the whole time. We spend so much time looking at screens. So it's definitely striking a nerve with people that it's a thing that they can do or listen to while they're, also engaged in something else that doesn't feel like more TV or more video games or more social media. And I think people like that.
I grew up on radio. I love radio. And lately, I just feel like the ad load on your average radio show is so oppressive at times. And of course, podcasts have ads, but it's often much, much less. It doesn't really get in the way. Where do you see radio and podcasting kind of going in the next couple of years? Because are they helping each other? Is the podcast world maybe gently pushing against radio to kind of change its ways and maybe modernize? You have any sort of sense in that regard?
I don't know. I mean, it's definitely easy for radio shows to become podcasts in the sense that it's on-demand audio. So you definitely have iHeartRadio making its shows available as podcasts. You have public radio stations making their shows available as podcasts, or even in certain cases taking shows that have been a daily or weekly show and transitioning them over to podcasts. But I guess I'm most interested in podcasting as a new medium untethered from radio. I think that, this long form serialized storytelling that's happening now in podcasting is because it's a different medium that's being consumed in a different way. And, you don't have many people walking around with white earbuds in, listening to radio. You have a lot of people with their white earbuds in listening to podcasts. And I think that is a different experience, a different listening experience. So I don't think radio is going away, but I think that, it's interesting to think about the kind of creative opportunities that podcasting unlocks that kind of have nothing to do with terrestrial radio in a way.
Gotcha. Another question. I read an interview with you. You talked about authenticity and how it matters so much to the podcast that you have in your lineup. Can you maybe expand about that a little bit? And what when you listen to a show or even just a pitch of a show, where does authenticity kind of factor in? And does it come up right away, or does it take a while to kind of filter in?
Well, I think that the person who, if it's a pitch, the person who's telling us the story needs to have some personal stake in it, or a personal passion about it. And while we try to tell our stories, especially in the investigative space, like a Dr. Death or a Gladiator, we're not necessarily putting the reporter's story, like their personal journey into the story, front and center. You still need to know why they're passionate about it. I think the listener wants to know. When it comes to hosts of our shows, it's the same thing. I think people don't want to hear like they're like a host that sounds like they're reading an audiobook, or a host that sounds like they're doing a travel show voiceover. They want to hear somebody who feels like they're speaking to you. Mm-hmm. They want it to be casual, sort of informal sounding. And if it's too kind of buttoned up, it's not what the podcast audience right now expects, I would say.
One last question. You seem like the perfect person to ask kind of a crystal ball question. Where do things go next? Podcasting, are there technologies that you're seeing sort of maybe that are 6 months to a year down the road that maybe will change the way we listen, or even just the kinds of stories or shows that are being produced? Are there any sort of trends you're seeing that may be more apparent later in the year or even in 2020?
I wish I knew. I don't know that I'm the right person to ask. I guess the best way I would answer that question is it seems like there's a lot of things in the hopper, and I have no idea right now which way it's all going to shake out, because you've got things like Spotify making a big push, or Luminary, which is the new pay app where it will be ad free and they're going to have exclusive content. You've got smart speakers, and this big push that people are going to start listening more and more on their smart speakers. But I don't think it's clear to me 12 months down the road which things turn out among those trends, like the specifically the trends being exclusive content on various platforms that listeners go to listen to, versus podcasts remaining free and ad supported everywhere. And then the other one being smart speakers. I don't know.
It is interesting. I feel like the culture is moving so quickly. It's hard to really kind of pin things down. But well, listen, Marshall, I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us about Wondery and the shows and all about podcasting. Of course, please sample any number of shows from Wondery, including, of course, Imagine Life and 1+1. Go to Wondery.com to get the full story. And Marshall, really appreciate your time, and I can't wait to see what else is happening from Wondery. It sounds like it's changing and growing every day.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it's been great talking to you.
Well, thanks again for listening. Don't forget to check out HollywoodandToto.com for both the show notes and, of course, the latest entertainment news. Please follow me at Twitter at HollywoodandToto. And we'd love it if you leave a podcast review over at iTunes. See you next week.